They say the house had been cold for years. Not the kind of cold that comes from a Wyoming winter, the kind that seeps through the cracks in the window frames and makes you pull your blanket a little tighter. No, this was a different kind of cold. A cold that lived in the walls. A cold that came from emptiness. The ranch was known as the Silence. A sprawling, lonely stretch of land with a house that sat in the middle of it like a tombstone. For years, only one man lived there. Thomas Hale, a man with a shadow in his past and eyes that had seen too much. Then Clara arrived. She was 50 years old, which in those days was a lifetime. She stepped off the stagecoach in the dusty town of Ash Fork with a single satchel, a thin scar that ran along her cheekbone, and a history she never ever spoke of. Her job was simple: cook the meals, keep the place tidy, and speak only when spoken to. And for months, she did just that. She moved through that cold house like a ghost. Her footsteps were soft on the floorboards, her voice even softer. She cooked in silence, she cleaned in silence, and she carried a quiet that was so deep, it seemed to have its own weight. Thomas, the rancher who'd hired her, didn't pry. He was a man of few words himself, but he watched her. He saw the way she'd pause by the window when the sun went down, staring out at the empty horizon. It was a look he recognized. He'd seen it in his own reflection. It was the look of someone waiting for a person who was never, ever coming back. You see, Clara had been told her whole life what she was worth, and it wasn't much. She was told she was too plain to be loved, too barren to be a wife. She'd been married off in a deal of convenience to a man with a thunderous voice and a cold heart. And when he found something better, he left her behind like a worn-out pair of boots. The silence she carried wasn't a choice. It was armor. It was the wall she'd built around the small, fragile part of herself that still remembered how to hope. Every day was the same. She'd rise before the sun, her hands moving through dough, kneading and pressing, turning flour and water into something that would rise, get punched down, and rise again. It was the only prayer she knew. She worked in a boarding house in town before coming to the ranch. The widow who ran it paid late, but always paid. The work was hard, the bed was lumpy, but the door had a lock. And for a woman like Clara, a locked door was its own kind of miracle. It meant safety. It meant the world was kept out. But a locked door also keeps the world from getting in. One afternoon, a ranch hand came through town, talking loud over a bowl of her stew. He mentioned that Thomas Hale was back. The son, the one who'd left years ago after his mother passed. The one who never sent word. He was home now, living alone in that big empty house. The Silence. Clara knew the name. Years ago, during a brutal snowstorm, she'd been carrying a sack of flour, struggling against the wind. The sack had slipped, but before it hit the ground, a pair of strong hands caught it. A young man with dark, serious eyes. He'd steadied the sack in her arms and said, "Careful there, ma'am." His voice was quiet, but it was kind. And in a world that had shown her very little kindness, she had never forgotten it. His name was Thomas Hale. She told herself it was just a coincidence, a common name. The dough rose, the stew simmered, the day went on. But deep inside her, in that place where she had buried all her hope, something shifted. It felt like a chair being pulled up to a cold, dead fire, waiting for someone to strike a match. A name from the past had just walked back into her life, and the question hanging in the air was simple. Would that past walk right by her, or would it knock on her door? The next morning, the market was a swirl of noise and life. Farmers haggling over potatoes, women trading gossip. It was the kind of noise Clara liked best, enough to fill the air, but not enough to demand anything from her. She was reaching for a sack of onions when a shadow fell over her. She felt it before she saw it, a stillness in the chaos. A voice, low and steady, said her name. Clara May. She hadn't heard her full name spoken in 20 years, not since her husband left. Her hand tightened on the rough burlap of the sack. She turned slow, like a woman who knew that sudden movements only ever led to trouble. It was him, Thomas Hale. He wasn't the boy from her memory anymore. The sharp edges of youth had been worn down by wind and work. There were deep lines etched beside his eyes, put there by the sun or by sorrow. She couldn't tell. His left hand had a thick, jagged scar across the knuckles that hadn't healed right. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the same. Quiet, serious. And they were looking at her like he actually saw her. It's been, what, 20 years? He asked. She could only manage a small nod. He gave a faint, sad smile. Long enough for a person to forget a face. Not quite, she whispered. The truth was, she remembered him perfectly. Not for some grand romantic moment, but for a small, simple act of kindness on a cold day. He had helped her without asking for anything in return, and then he had walked away without lingering. In Clara's world, where men usually took far more than they gave, that was a rare and precious gift. They stood there for a moment, the bustling market fading into a blur around them. The smell of potatoes and damp earth hung in the air. He asked about her work at the boarding house. She kept her answers short, polite but guarded. When she finally turned to leave, clutching her onions, he spoke again. His voice was so quiet she almost missed it. I've got a place, west of town. It's big, and it's empty. He paused, looking down at his scarred hands. And I'm not much good at feeding myself. If you ever get tired of cooking for strangers, there's a kitchen out there that could use your hands. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even really an invitation. It was something else, a seed tossed onto dry, barren ground. Clara walked away without another word. Her mind, usually so still, was a storm of prairie grass in a high wind. All the way back to the boarding house, she told herself no, absolutely not. She had a job, a room, a life that was steady, predictable, and safe behind her locked door. But his words echoed in her head. There's a kitchen out there that could use your hands. He hadn't said he needed a wife. He hadn't said he needed a woman. He'd said her hands had value. That night, as she lay in her lumpy bed, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, she stared into the darkness and wondered. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure if the quiet in her life was peace or if it was just emptiness wearing a different name. A man from her past had just opened a door she didn't even know was there, a door leading out into the cold, empty silence. Would she dare to take a single step through it? 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of Clara telling herself to forget it, to forget him. But the thought of his offer was a stubborn weed, pushing its way through the cracks in her carefully constructed life. It would show up while she was peeling carrots, the knife still in her hand. It would appear while she mended the sleeve of her only good dress, the needle pausing mid-stitch. It would whisper to her in the dead of night, when the only sound was the lonely whistle of the wind. It wasn't just the offer of a job. It was the way he'd said it, the way he'd looked at her. Like he saw a person, not just a pair of hands to do the work. It was a look she hadn't seen in the mirror in 20 years. On a Tuesday afternoon, after she'd delivered a pot of stew to the pastor's wife, her feet made a decision her mind hadn't agreed to yet. Instead of turning back toward the boarding house, she found herself walking west, down the road that led out of town. The path narrowed, the last few houses giving way to open, windswept land. She told herself she was just curious, just stretching her legs, just wanted to see how a man could live all by himself out here. Then the ranch came into view. The silence. It was just as the story said. A wide, lonely stretch of faded grass. A barn that leaned slightly, as if it were tired of standing against the wind. And in the center of it all, a simple, solid house with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It looked like the loneliest place on earth. She stopped at the fence line, her fingers resting on the rough, weathered wood of the top rail. She stood there for a long time, just watching. Then the door of the barn creaked open. Thomas stepped out, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. He saw her immediately, but he didn't look surprised. He didn't look startled. He just looked like he'd been waiting. "You found the place," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was just passing by," she replied, the lie feeling flimsy and foolish in the open air. They both knew it wasn't true. He nodded slowly toward the house. "Coffee's hot." Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else. Something faintly sad. The kitchen was bare, but spotless. A long wooden table stood in the center, scrubbed clean. There were 2 chairs. One was pushed in, The other was pulled out slightly, as if waiting for a guest. The silence in this house was different from the silence in her room. Hers was a silence of defense. This was a silence of loss. They didn't talk much at first. He asked if she liked the boarding house. She said it was fine. He asked if she ever missed the quiet of the country. She said sometimes. The coffee was black and strong, and the warmth of the mug felt good in her cold hands. Then he leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her. They weren't judging eyes. They were knowing. He asked a question that landed like a stone in the still, quiet pool of her heart. Do you miss being seen, Clara May? She froze. The mug trembled in her hands. She thought of all the years she'd spent being invisible, not hiding in the shadows, but standing in plain sight while people looked right through her. The woman he walked away from. The quiet cook. The lonely spinster. She looked down at her hands, at the nicks and scars from a lifetime of work. I suppose, she said, her voice barely a whisper, I stopped expecting it. He watched her for a long moment. Maybe you shouldn't have. The words hung in the air between them, warm and unsettling. They were the most dangerous words anyone had ever spoken to her, because they sounded like the truth. A truth she had tried to bury for decades. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, suddenly unsure if she was cold or if the walls she had built around her heart were finally starting to tremble. When she left that day, he didn't ask her to come back. He didn't press her for an answer about the job. He just stood on the porch and watched her walk away down the long, lonely road back to town. But as she walked, her feet felt heavier than they had when she arrived. It felt as if she were carrying something new, something that felt an awful lot like hope. And hope for a woman like Clara was the most terrifying thing in the world. She had spent her life asking for nothing and expecting even less. Now one man's quiet questions were shaking the foundations of a fortress she'd spent decades building. Would she patch the cracks and build the walls higher? Or would she let them fall? Clara didn't go back for another week. Distance, she told herself, was a sensible thing. It kept a woman's heart from getting foolish ideas. It kept her safe. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. That bare kitchen table, the empty chair pulled out just for her, the look in Thomas's eyes that said, I see you. One evening, Mrs. Lyle, the boarding house owner, was tasting the stew. Clara, she said, her brow furrowed, this tastes different, softer somehow. Clara didn't say a word, but she knew why. Ever since she'd sat at that table with Thomas, her hands had started to remember what it felt like to cook for someone. Not just for a job, not just for strangers, but for someone who noticed. When she finally did go back to the ranch, she didn't go empty-handed. She brought a loaf of sourdough bread, still warm from the oven, wrapped in a clean cloth. She found Thomas by the woodpile, splitting kindling. The axe rose and fell with a steady, rhythmic thud. He wore a worn-out coat, and the cold had turned his cheeks red. He stopped when he saw her, resting the axe against the chopping block. He looked at the bundle in her hands and then at her face. A slow smile spread across his lips. He took the bread from her, holding it gently, as if it were something fragile and precious. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice low. I know, she replied, but I wanted to. Inside, they shared a simple meal, fresh bread, a block of sharp cheese, and that same brutally strong coffee. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, a cheerful sound in the quiet house. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara laughed. Thomas had told a dry, funny story about a stubborn mule, and a small, rusty laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. The sound surprised her. She felt the echo of it in her chest, a strange and pleasant warmth that lingered long after the sound had faded. It felt like coming home. But when she returned to her small room at the boarding house that night, something was waiting for her. It was a single piece of paper, folded neatly, lying on her pillow. There was no envelope, no name. She unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp and angry, the letters gouged into the cheap paper. Don't think a man like that will keep you. You've been left before. You'll be left again. The breath left her body in a rush. The warmth from the evening vanished, replaced by an icy dread. She didn't need a signature to know who it was from. Her late husband had a cousin, a bitter, cruel man named Jed, who had always blamed Clara for her husband leaving. In his eyes, she was worthless, and she had no right to any kind of happiness. He made sure to remind her of it every few years. She sank onto the bed, the note still in her hand. The old voices came rushing back, the ones that told her she was too plain, too quiet, too old, too empty. For a moment she believed them. The note was right. She had been left before. Why would this be any different? What was she thinking, laughing in a man's kitchen and baking him bread? She was a fool. She folded the note, her hands trembling, and slid it into the drawer of her nightstand, out of sight. But it wasn't out of mind. The words were burned into her memory. She stared at the plain wooden wall until the oil in her lamp burned out, plunging the room into darkness. The ugly words from the note circled in her head, pulling her down, down, down into the familiar darkness of despair. But then, another voice pushed its way through. A quieter voice, a steadier voice. Thomas's voice. Maybe you shouldn't have stopped expecting to be seen. The ghosts of your past don't knock. They walk right in. They sit down at your table and dare you to make them leave. Clara had spent a lifetime backing down. She had survived by making herself small, by swallowing the cruel words, by accepting the scraps she was given. Now standing in the darkness of her room, caught between an old familiar fear and a new terrifying possibility, she had a choice to make. Which voice would she listen to? Which ghost would she feed? The next morning, Clara was up before the first hint of dawn. She could have stayed in bed. She could have pulled the quilt over her head and let the cold, gray morning and the even colder words from that letter win. But she didn't. Instead, she went to the kitchen. She moved with a fierce, quiet purpose. Flour dusted the air like a fine mist. Butter softened by the heat of the stove, the rich, earthy smell of yeast rising. This was the language she knew best. It was how she fought back. By the time the sun finally cracked over the frozen hills, 2 perfect apple pies were cooling on the windowsill. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples filled the small kitchen, a warm, defiant answer to the cold cruelty of the night before. One pie was for Mrs. Lyle, a thank you and a goodbye. The other was for Thomas. She didn't pack her satchel. She just put on her coat, picked up the pie, and walked out the door of the boarding house for the last time. She was walking west. She was walking toward the silence. She didn't know if she was walking toward a new home or a new heartbreak, but for the first time in her life, she was walking toward something instead of away. She found him mending a fence post at the edge of his property, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows despite the biting wind. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the frozen ground, his expression shifting from surprise to something else, something warm. "You're early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice stronger than she expected. She set the pie down on the porch rail. His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Then I'm glad for your restlessness." They ate slices of the pie at the kitchen table, the steam from the warm apples curling up into the cold air. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet now, a shared quiet. Halfway through his slice, Thomas put his fork down and leaned back, studying her face. "You're carrying something heavy, Clara," he said, his voice gentle. "I could see it in your shoulders the first day you came here. It's a little lighter today, but it's still there." She froze, the pie turning to ash in her mouth. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't demanding. He was just leaving a space for her to set down the burden if she wanted to. It wasn't like her to speak of the past. Her story was a thing of shame, a heavy cloak she'd worn for so long it felt like a part of her skin. But here in this quiet kitchen, with this quiet man, the words started to come. She told him everything. About the marriage that was a business deal. About the husband who measured her worth in acres and livestock. She told him about the cousin, Jed, who saw her as a stain on the family name. And she told him about the note. She told him about the whispers that had followed her for years. The whispers that said a woman her age, a woman left behind, should be grateful for any roof, any table, any scrap of kindness. Thomas just listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer cheap reassurances. He just sat there and let her finally speak her truth into the quiet air of his kitchen. He let her be seen. When she finally fell silent, her voice hoarse, her eyes wet, he didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell her to forget the past. He simply reached across the table and said, his voice full of a conviction that shook her to her core. You are not a problem to be solved, Clara May. You are a person worth knowing. And in that moment, something inside her didn't just crack, it shattered. Not in the way that breaks you, but in the way that finally lets the light in. For her entire life, she had been bracing for the sound of a door closing behind her. She had been waiting for the footsteps to walk away. For the first time, she thought that maybe, just maybe, she could leave the door wide open. And maybe, just maybe, he would want to stay. The walls Clara had built to keep herself safe had nearly become her tomb. Now, with the door finally creaking open, would she have the courage to step out into the light? Or would the shadows of her past prove too long to outrun? Clara had been at the ranch for a month of quiet days and peaceful nights. The cold in the house was gone, replaced by the smell of baking bread and the warmth from the constantly stoked fire. The silence was still there, but it was a shared silence now, comfortable and easy. It was the silence of two people who didn't need words to understand each other. She was kneading dough on the big kitchen counter, her hands moving in the familiar rhythmic motion, when she heard it, the sound of hooves. It wasn't Thomas's horse. This was slower, more deliberate, not the sound of a neighbor dropping by for coffee. She glanced out the window. A single rider was coming up the lane, a dark shape against the pale winter sky. The front door opened and Thomas stepped out from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Clara couldn't see his face clearly, but she could see the sudden tension in his shoulders. He stood on the porch, waiting. The rider dismounted. He was a tall, thin man in a dusty brown coat that was frayed at the cuffs. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. He moved with a lazy, arrogant swagger that made the hair on Clara's arms stand up. Thomas called her outside. His voice was even, but she could hear the steel underneath it. Clara, come out here a minute. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She stepped onto the porch, squinting against the bright, cold light. This here is Samuel Turner, Thomas said, his voice flat and guarded. Says he's looking for work. Samuel Turner's eyes found Clara. They were small, dark, and greedy, and there was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition and contempt, that made her instinctively take a step back. I knew your husband, Samuel said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He wasn't looking at Thomas. He was looking straight at Clara. Reed, knew you too, though you probably don't remember me. Reed, her husband's name, the name she had tried to erase from her life. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a stranger looking for work. This was a ghost from her past standing right here on her porch. He let out a slow, mocking smile, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. News travels, Mrs. Reed. Folks in town are saying you've landed right proper for yourself. Cooking for the rancher, here, keeping his house warm. He gestured vaguely at the house. Thought I'd come see if there was any room for an old friend of the family. There was no friendship in his tone. It was a threat, wrapped in a thin veil of civility. It was the same old poison she'd been fed her whole life. The idea that she was property, a claim to be staked, a thing to be used. Thomas's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as ice. She's not a piece of land for you to visit, Turner. You can turn your horse around and ride back the way you came. Samuel just laughed, a low, ugly sound. Now, hold on. I'm just talking. No harm in that. Clara felt the old fear rise up in her throat, thick and choking. The instinct to shrink, to apologize, to make herself small and disappear so the trouble would go away. She could feel her hands starting to tremble. But then she looked at Thomas. He was standing beside her, solid and unmovable as an old oak tree. And she remembered his words. You are a person worth knowing. She took a slow breath. The cold air filled her lungs. She took one step forward, planting her feet firmly on the wooden porch. She lifted her chin and met Samuel Turner's cold, dead eyes. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried across the yard with the clear, sharp ring of a bell. There is no place for you here, she said. Not now. Not ever. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The wind died down. The world seemed to hold its breath. Samuel Turner stared at her, his mocking smile gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He had expected a timid, broken woman. He wasn't prepared for this. He held her gaze for a long, tense moment. Then he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. Without another word, he swung himself back onto his horse and rode away, kicking up dust as he went. As the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the distance, Thomas turned to look at her. There was no surprise on his face. There was only a deep, quiet pride. "You didn't need me to run him off," he said softly. "You did that all by yourself." Clara felt her knees go weak with relief, but inside, in her soul, something stood up taller than it ever had before. She had faced down a ghost from her past, and the ghost had blinked. That night, over a supper of stew and fresh bread, Thomas reached across the simple wooden table and gently took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused from work, but his touch was warm. "You belong here, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And for the very first time in her 50 years of life, she let herself believe it. She had spent a lifetime being told all the places she didn't belong. Now she had finally found a place worth fighting for. But as the winter snows began to fall, burying the ranch in a deep, silent blanket of white, a new question began to form in her mind. She had found the courage to claim her place, but would she have the courage to ask for more than just safety? Would she dare to ask for a home? Winter came to the valley in earnest. The wind howled around the corners of the house, and the snow piled up in deep drifts against the barn. Inside, the world had shrunk to the warm, fire-lit space of the kitchen and the living room. For Clara, it wasn't confining. It was safe. It was peaceful. She had settled into the rhythm of the ranch as if she'd been born to it, baking bread before the sun rose, the whole house filling with its comforting scent, mending Thomas's worn shirts by the soft glow of the lamplight, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire. But it was more than just the work. It was the silence. This house, once called the silence for its emptiness and sorrow, was still quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the silence of being ignored or forgotten. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without needing to fill the air with noise. It was the silence of peace. One late afternoon, the snow was coming down thick and fast, a swirling curtain of white that erased the rest of the world. Thomas came in from the barn, his coat and hat caked with snow. He stomped his boots on the mat, shaking the cold from his shoulders. Clara was setting a fresh-baked pie on the windowsill to cool. He stood there for a long moment, just watching her. The firelight played on her face, softening the lines of worry and time, revealing the quiet strength that had always been there underneath. "I've been thinking," he began. His voice was slow, as if the words were heavy, but worth the effort of carrying. Clara turned, wiping a dusting of flour from her hands onto her apron. "About what?" He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing just a few feet away. The warmth from the stove radiated between them. She could see the faint smile in his eyes. "You've been here for months now, Clara," he said. "You've filled this house with life. You've made this place warmer than all the fires I could ever build." He paused and his gaze grew more intense. "And I realized something. I don't want to think about this house without you in it. Not ever again." Her breath caught in her throat. She had allowed herself to hope for kindness, for friendship, maybe even for a permanent place as his cook and housekeeper. But this was something else entirely, something deeper, something that dared her to believe in a possibility she had locked away decades ago. He took another step, closing the small distance between them. He reached out, not to touch her, but just holding his hand in the space between them, an offering. "You're the reason this place feels like home," he said, his voice soft but clear and steady as a rock. "Don't leave, Clara." He looked directly into her eyes and the world seemed to stop. "Not because I need a cook, not because the work is easier with two people, but because I want you here. You, just as you are." The years, all the years of being told she was not enough, too plain, too quiet, too old, too broken. All of those cruel, cutting words seemed to dissolve in the warmth of his gaze. They melted away like snow in the spring sun. She felt the sharp sting of tears in her eyes, but for the first time in her life, she let them come. They weren't tears of sorrow or loss. They were tears of finding, of being found. She couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, so she just nodded. Once, a small, simple movement that carried the weight of a lifetime. "I'm not leaving," she whispered, the words tasting of salt and relief. Thomas's smile finally reached his eyes, and it was like watching the sun break through the clouds after a long, hard winter. The kind of smile that feels like a promise made and a promise kept. Outside, the snow fell, silent and steady, covering the hard, frozen earth in a blanket of pure, clean white. But inside the small, warm house, a new season had begun. Sometimes home isn't the place you are born. It's the place you are seen. It's the person who looks at you and chooses you back. And sometimes, after a lifetime of walking down lonely, dusty roads, you find that love doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm, loud and violent. Sometimes it arrives quietly on a snowy afternoon, with a steady hand, a soft voice, and a seat kept warm for you by the fire. After a lifetime of living in other people's shadows, Clara had finally found a place where she was allowed to stand in the light. She had found her home. She had found her peace, or so she thought, because out there in the swirling snow, the ghost she thought she had vanquished was riding back. And he wasn't alone. The past wasn't finished with Clara May. Not by a long shot, and the real storm was just about to begin. The happiness was so new, so fragile, that Clara was almost afraid to touch it, for fear it might shatter. For 2 weeks, life at the ranch was a quiet dream. They talked more, laughed more. The silence was still there, but it was filled with unspoken affection, with the comfortable rhythm of two people building a life together. But the world outside the ranch hadn't forgotten them. It happened on a Thursday. Thomas had ridden into town for supplies, a trip that should have taken him half the day. When dusk began to settle, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of purple and gray, and he still hadn't returned, a knot of worry began to tighten in Clara's stomach. She told herself he was fine. Maybe he'd met a friend. Maybe a wheel on the wagon broke. There were 100 sensible reasons for him to be late, but the feeling of dread grew colder and heavier with each passing hour. Just as darkness fell completely, she heard the sound of a single horse approaching, much faster than Thomas would ride. She ran to the door, her heart pounding, and threw it open. It wasn't Thomas. It was the sheriff, and he was alone. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his face grim in the lantern light. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "There's been an incident in town. Thomas, he's been arrested." The world tilted. The porch seemed to drop out from under her feet. "Arrested? For what?" The sheriff finally looked at her, and his eyes were full of pity. "For murder, ma'am." Clara's mind went blank. Murder? Thomas? It was impossible. He was the gentlest man she'd ever known. Who? Who did they say he killed? The sheriff took a deep breath. "A man named Jed, your husband's cousin." Jed, the man who had sent the threatening note, the man who had tormented her for years. The floorboards seemed to sway beneath her. Jed was here? In Ash Fork? "He was found this afternoon," the sheriff continued, his voice low. "Behind the saloon. Witnesses say him and Thomas had words earlier. Loud words. Thomas was seen leaving the alley right around the time it happened." It was a nightmare. A trap. She knew it in her bones. This had Samuel Turner's stench all over it. This was their revenge for her defiance. They couldn't break her, so they were going to break the man she loved. "He didn't do it," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "Thomas would never?" "I hope you're right, ma'am," the sheriff said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Because right now it looks bad. Real bad." After the sheriff left, Clara stood alone in the cold, silent house. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing embers. The half-prepared dinner sat on the counter, forgotten. The silence had returned, but this time it was a suffocating, terrifying thing. They had taken him. They had framed him. They had put him in a cage, and they were going to let the town's judgment and a hangman's noose do the rest. The old Clara would have crumbled. She would have hidden. She would have accepted this as her fate, another cruel twist in a life full of them. But she wasn't the old Clara anymore. She stood there in the quiet kitchen, the heart of the home she and Thomas had started to build, and she felt a new kind of fire ignite within her. It wasn't the warm, gentle flame of love. It was the cold, hard, burning rage of a woman with nothing left to lose. They thought she was just a quiet cook, a timid spinster, a fragile old woman. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. She walked to the fireplace and picked up the iron poker, its weight heavy and solid in her hand. They had taken her home. They had taken her future. They had taken her Thomas. She was going to get him back, no matter what it took. The next morning, Clara rode into Ashfork. She wasn't the same woman who had stepped off the stagecoach months ago. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a steely resolve. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a fighter. The town was buzzing with the news. She could feel the stares as she walked down the main street, could hear the whispers behind cupped hands. That's her, the rancher's woman, the one whose kin got himself killed. They had already tried and convicted Thomas in the court of public opinion. Her first stop was the jail. It was a small, grim building made of stone. The deputy, a young man with a nervous twitch, looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. "He ain't allowed visitors," the deputy said, blocking the door to the cells. Clara looked him straight in the eye. Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge that made the young man flinch. "I didn't ride all this way for a visit. I'm here to tell the sheriff what really happened." The sheriff met her in his office. He looked tired. He listened patiently as Clara told him everything. About Samuel Turner, about the history of harassment from her husband's family, about the confrontation at the ranch. She insisted it was a setup. "I believe you believe that, ma'am," the sheriff said, rubbing his eyes. "But what you have is a story. What I have are 3 witnesses who saw Thomas threatening Jed and a dead body in the alley. My hands are tied." Frustration and despair washed over her. It was her word against theirs, a lone woman's word against the lies of dangerous men. She left the sheriff's office feeling defeated, the cold winter air biting at her cheeks. As she stood on the boardwalk, trying to figure out her next move, she saw him, Samuel Turner. He was standing across the street, leaning against a post, watching her. When their eyes met, he gave her that same slow, mocking smile. He lifted his hat in a gesture of false politeness, then turned and sauntered into the saloon. He wasn't hiding. He was gloating. He wanted her to see him. He wanted her to know that he had won. That's when she knew. She couldn't fight this with the law. The law was broken. The law was blind. She had to fight it their way. She needed proof. Something the sheriff couldn't ignore, and she had a feeling she knew where to find it. Samuel Turner was arrogant. He was cocky, and cocky men get careless. That night, Clara didn't go back to the ranch. She took a room at the boarding house, the very place she had left to start her new life. It felt like a lifetime ago. Mrs. Lyle, the owner, gave her a sympathetic look but asked no questions, for which Clara was grateful. She waited in her small dark room, listening to the sounds of the town die down. The rowdy shouts from the saloon faded. The last wagon rattled by. The town clock struck midnight. Then, dressed in dark clothes, she slipped out the back door of the boarding house. She moved through the shadows of the alleyways, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified. Every creak, every gust of wind made her jump. But the image of Thomas's face, his kind, steady eyes, pushed her forward. She knew which room was Turner's. She'd overheard him talking to the stable boy earlier. It was at the back of the hotel overlooking the alley. The light was off. Getting in was easier than she'd expected. A window had been left unlatched. She slid it open, wincing at the faint squeal it made, and slipped inside. The room smelled of stale whiskey and unwashed clothes. The moonlight coming through the window cast long shadows across the floor. Turner was a slob. His belongings were strewn everywhere. She searched quickly, her hands shaking. She checked under the lumpy mattress. She went through the pockets of his dusty coat. Nothing. She was about to give up, her hopes sinking, when she saw it. Tucked inside his saddlebag, which was tossed in a corner, was a leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with names, dates, and numbers. It looked like a record of business dealings. But as she flipped through the pages, her eyes landed on a familiar name, Reed, her husband. And next to his name were entries detailing shipments, payments, and land purchases. Her husband wasn't just a horsebreaker. He was involved in something much bigger, and it was all connected to this region. Then she saw the last entry, dated just 2 days ago. It wasn't a number. It was a note, scrawled in Turner's messy handwriting. Jed's taken care of. The rancher is out of the way. The land is ours. Reed will be pleased. The book slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. It was all there. The proof. The conspiracy. Jed's murder was just a means to an end. The real prize was the ranch. Thomas's land. But why? Why was his land so important? Before she could process the question, she heard a sound that made her blood turn to ice. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps coming down the hall. And they stopped right outside the door. The doorknob began to turn. Panic seized her. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The room was a box, a trap. The door creaked open. A large silhouette filled the doorway. It wasn't Turner. It was a man she didn't recognize. One of the men who had been with Turner at the saloon. He stepped into the room, and in the dim moonlight, she saw the glint of a knife in his hand. He saw her at the same time. His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with menace. Well, well, look what we have here. Clara's mind raced, the window. It was her only chance. She lunged for it, but he was faster. He grabbed her arm, his fingers like a steel vise. He yanked her back, throwing her against the wall. Her head hit the wood with a sickening crack, and the room spun. You shouldn't have come here, he snarled, raising the knife. But just as he lunged, a loud crash came from the hallway, followed by a shout. The man hesitated, his head turning toward the door. That single moment of distraction was all Clara needed. With a surge of adrenaline, she brought her knee up hard, connecting with his groin. He let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. She twisted away, scrambling for the open window. She threw herself through it, not caring about the fall. She landed hard in the muddy alley below, the impact jarring every bone in her body. She didn't wait to see if he was following. She scrambled to her feet and ran. She ran blindly through the dark, twisting alleys, her lungs burning, her heart about to explode. She could hear shouts behind her. They were chasing her. She burst out onto the main street, nearly colliding with a man who was just leaving the sheriff's office. It was the sheriff. Mrs. Reed, he exclaimed, grabbing her arms to steady her. What in God's name? She couldn't speak. She could only point back toward the hotel, gasping for breath. At that moment, Turner's man appeared at the mouth of the alley, knife still in hand. He saw the sheriff and froze, his face a mask of fury and panic. That was all the confirmation the sheriff needed. He drew his pistol. Drop the knife, now! The fight was over. Back in the sheriff's office, the ledger lay open on the desk between them. The full story was beginning to unravel. Samuel Turner and his men were rounded up. Under questioning, one of them broke, confessing everything. Jed had been a liability, a drunk who knew too much and talked too much. Turner had killed him and framed Thomas to get him out of the way. But the biggest revelation came from the ledger itself. The sheriff, tracing the land deeds and transactions, made a shocking discovery. Your husband, Mrs. Reed, he said, his voice grave. He wasn't just a horsebreaker. According to this, he and Thomas's father were partners, and it looks like they were systematically buying up all the land around the Hale Ranch, all except for one key parcel. He pointed to a map on the wall. The spring, the only reliable source of water for miles. It's on Thomas's land. Without it, all this surrounding land they bought is worthless. Thomas's mother refused to sell. After she died and Thomas's father left, the land went to Thomas. They've been waiting all these years for a chance to get it. It all clicked into place. The harassment, Samuel Turner's appearance, the frame-up. It was never about her. She was just a pawn in a much larger, much older game. And her husband Reed, the man she thought was long gone, a ghost from her past. The ledger made one thing terrifyingly clear. He wasn't a ghost. The entries were recent. He was alive. and he was the one pulling all the strings. Thomas was released the next morning. When he walked out of the jail, the first person he saw was Clara. The relief on his face was so profound, it almost brought her to her knees. He walked toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around her and held her, his grip tight and sure. In his arms, the fear and the exhaustion of the last 2 days finally washed away, leaving only a deep, quiet certainty. "You saved me," he whispered into her hair. "We saved each other," she replied. They thought it was over. They thought they had won. They believed that with the truth revealed, they would finally be safe. But the man named Reed was still out there. A man who had built an empire on lies and deceit. A man who had just lost everything. And he knew exactly who to blame. They wouldn't see him coming. But he was coming. He was coming back to Ashfork. He was coming back for his wife. And he was coming back for the land. The final battle for the silence was about to be fought, not in a jail cell or a courtroom, but right on their own front porch. A fragile peace settled over the ranch. With Turner and his men behind bars, it seemed the threat had passed. The snow melted, revealing the first green shoots of spring. It was a season of new beginnings, and for Clara and Thomas, every day felt like a gift. They worked side by side, repairing the fences, planting a small garden, turning the cold, silent house into a real home, filled with the sounds of their shared life. They didn't talk about Reed. It was an unspoken agreement. The name was a dark cloud they didn't want casting a shadow over their newfound happiness. They knew he was out there, somewhere, but they allowed themselves to believe he wouldn't dare show his face in Ashfork again. They were wrong. It was a quiet evening. A storm was rolling in from the mountains, the sky a dark, bruised purple. Clara was putting away the last of the dinner dishes, while Thomas sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. A knock came at the door. It wasn't a loud knock. It was soft, polite, almost hesitant. Thomas looked at Clara, a questioning look in his eyes. They weren't expecting anyone. He set the rifle down on the table and went to the door. Clara stood by the counter, a dish towel in her hands, a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread creeping over her. Thomas opened the door. A man stood on the porch, silhouetted against the stormy sky. He was well-dressed, in a dark suit and a bowler hat. He looked like a businessman from the city, not a man of the frontier. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, his voice cautious. The man smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. He removed his hat. "I believe you have something of mine," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "In fact, you have two things of mine. My land and my wife." He stepped forward into the light of the doorway. Clara's heart stopped. The dish towel slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor. It was Reed. He was older, his face harsher, but it was him, the man who had haunted her memories for 20 years, the man she thought she had escaped, the man who was supposed to be dead. "Clara, my dear," he said, his eyes locking on her. "You look, well, country life agrees with you." Thomas moved instinctively, placing himself between Clara and the door. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice a low growl. Reed's eyes flickered to the rifle on the table, then back to Thomas. He chuckled. "Oh, I think I am. You see, according to the law, this woman is still my wife. And according to some very old paperwork, this land, or at least the water that makes it valuable, belongs to my partnership. You've been trespassing." "That partnership is dissolved," Thomas said, his fist clenching. "Not in the eyes of a corrupt judge it isn't," Reed replied smoothly. "I'm not here to fight you, Hale. I'm a businessman. I'm here to make a final offer. Sign the deed over to me, and I'll walk away. I'll even grant my wife a divorce. You two can live out your pathetic little lives here in peace. Refuse." He let the word hang in the air. "And I will use every tool at my disposal to ruin you. I'll drag you through the courts for years. I'll bleed you dry. And I will take her, because she is still, legally, my property." It was a checkmate. He had them trapped. He knew they didn't have the money or the influence to fight him in a rigged legal system. Clara felt the old terror trying to reclaim her, the urge to run, to hide, to give in. But then she looked at Thomas's face. She saw the despair in his eyes, the realization that he was about to lose everything he had just found, and she knew she could not let that happen. She took a step forward, moving to stand beside Thomas. She looked her former husband in the eye, the man who had tried to break her, to erase her. "You are wrong," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am not your property, and this is not your land." Reed's smile faltered. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He didn't see the timid, obedient girl he had married. He saw a woman made of iron. "You have no power here," he sneered. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong again," Clara said. A memory was surfacing, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't understood until this very moment. A conversation she'd overheard years ago between Reed and Thomas's father. They had been drinking, celebrating a deal. They thought she wasn't listening. "I remember you and Thomas's father talking," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "You were laughing. You called yourselves the Wyoming Land and Cattle Company. You said you'd registered the partnership name in Cheyenne. You were so proud of it." Reed's face went pale. Clara pressed on, the pieces falling into place. "But I also remember something else. A few weeks later, you were furious. You'd had a letter. You said the territorial clerk was an idiot. He'd made a mistake on the paperwork. He'd listed the partnership as a temporary venture with a dissolution date. A date that was, let me think, 20 years ago." The color drained completely from Reed's face. He knew she was telling the truth. "The partnership is void," Clara said, her voice ringing with triumph. "It has been for years. You have no legal claim to this land. You have no power over us. You have nothing." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rising wind. Reed stared at her, his mask of civilized control finally cracking, revealing the desperate, greedy man underneath. He had lost, and he knew it. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He lunged, not for Thomas, but for Clara. "You!" He never finished the sentence. Thomas was faster. He moved like lightning, grabbing the rifle from the table. He didn't fire it. He used it as a shield, blocking Reed's path, shoving him back toward the door with a force that sent him stumbling out onto the porch. "Get off my land!" Thomas roared, his voice echoing the thunder that was now rolling across the valley. Reed scrambled to his feet, his fine suit covered in dirt. He gave them one last look of venomous rage, then turned and fled into the growing storm, a broken man swallowed by the darkness. Clara and Thomas stood in the doorway, the wind whipping at their clothes, and watched him go. The rain began to fall, a hard, clean rain that washed the dust from the air. It was over. For good. Thomas turned to Clara. He looked at her, his eyes filled with awe, and a love so deep it took her breath away. "You remembered," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I remember everything," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. He reached out and gently touched the scar on her cheek, the mark of her old life, and then he leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of rain and relief, and the promise of 1,000 quiet tomorrows. The storm broke over the valley, but inside the house there was no longer any cold, no longer any silence. There was only the warmth of the fire and the steady, peaceful sound of two hearts finally, truly at home. This story is a reminder that the past does not have to define our future. It's a testament to the fact that strength isn't about being the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it's about the quiet resolve to simply endure, to remember, and to stand your ground when it matters most. It's about finding love late in life and realizing that it's all the sweeter for the long, hard wait. Clara and Thomas prove that it's never too late to rewrite your own story, to face down your ghosts, and to turn a house of silence into a home filled with love. If this story of quiet courage and second chances resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and join our community. Every story we tell is about the strength of the human spirit on the unforgiving frontier. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters, and let us know in the comments below. What's a time you found strength you didn't know you had? We read every single one. Thanks for listening.